Hello, today I'm telling you the story of the 57 Regimental Scouts and why are they so special in Philippine history. Let's get started. But first, I'll give you a little recap of what happened in World War II in the Philippines. World War II was fought in the Philippines over 81 years ago. When the war broke out in the Pacific, the Philippines was in the center of hostilities, since the Japanese war economy needed raw materials in Southeast Asia. The Philippines, with its central location, was a prime target, partly because the US forces country would block Japanese access to resources in Southeast Asia, partly because the Japanese needed to resource shipping lanes to Japan, and partly because the Philippines had important resources which are crucial to the war economy of Japan. The Philippines was not yet independent then, but was preparing for independence that was scheduled in 1946. Since the US naval air and military bases in the Philippines threatened the Japanese advance into southern areas, the US forces had to be crushed. Thus, Clark Field was a priority target to the Japanese on the first day of the war. But the Philippines was attacked without warning, and Filipinos were killed in the early unannounced air raids. The Philippine Army had been created in 1935 to defend the Philippines against foreign invasions, had been mobilized in late 1941, and was united with the U.S. Army forces in the Philippines in the newly organized U.S. Army forces in the Far East, or more likely known as USAF, or USAFFE. It would bear the brunt of defending the islands against the unprovoked assault. When World War II broke out, the Philippines was a Commonwealth government, largely autonomous in the terms of international government. President Manuel L. Quezon was elected the first president of the Philippine Commonwealth, inaugurated on November 15, 1935. The first act, personally prioritized by Quezon, was Commonwealth Act Number 1, the National Defense Act. This created the Philippine Army to protect the Philippines from external threats. Young men were called to train for 5.5 months, after which they become part of the growing reserves. College students also become reservists. The Reserves Officer Training Corps, or OTC. National defense was a primary responsibility of the state, and the young men understood that this one was prerequisites of the independent country. When the war broke out, many of the Philippine Army reservists had been called to active duty for refresher training. The surprise attacks by the Japanese aircrafts on the Philippine soil were direct challenges to the Philippine sovereignty, as were the landings on far-flung Philippine territory. The people rallied to defense of the nation, and links between the Revolution of 1896 and the Republic of 1898 were quickly made. Volunteers flooded the enlistment centers. Even underage and overage men presented themselves. Women too sought to participate in the defense of the homeland. Although many books have been written on World War II in the Philippines on the defense campaign, the guerrilla resistance movement, the liberation campaigns, life under Japanese occupation despite the wealth of published material of the war, the Filipino perspective is not fully written. The majority of the defenders of Bataan were Filipinos, not professional soldiers, but reservists and volunteers. Fighting spirit was strong, but there were shortages of food and medicine. Air cover and the naval support were virtually nil, thus placing the burden of the ground defenses on these Filipinos. After the capitulation of Bataan and Corregidor, that fighting spirit continued as Filipinos fought on as guerrillas. The contribution of Filipino guerrillas to the war effort in teams of providing intelligence and limiting the movement of Japanese ground forces have not been fully recognized up to now, and during the Revelation era, as MacArthur and his men returned, Filipinos played important roles. But the battles of Pesang Pass and Ipodang, the securing of towns in the Visayas and Mindanao are among the many that Filipinos have won. Now established under the National Defense Act of 1935, Commonwealth Act Number 1, the Philippine Army had only begun to organize itself as a fighting force by the time of the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. There were 2 regular divisions and 10 reserve divisions, numbering around 100,000 men scattered over the archipelago. The Philippine Army was at the time under the command of the United States Armed Forces Far East, more likely known as USAF. The Philippine Army was organized primarily as an infantry force with some attached combat engineers and artillery. The Philippine Army's offshore patrol supplied the naval assets with a small force of U-boats and auxiliary vessels, while the fledgling Philippine Army Air Corps PAC consisted of a few obsolete fighters and bombers and several auxiliary aircrafts, mostly for training and observation. The Philippine Army saw many difficulties in training besides lack of equipment. There were a signified language barrier between some of the provincial troops who spoke their own dialects, their Tagalog-speaking officers, and the American trainers who spoke only English. The beginning of the hostilities was the saw of the majority of the Philippine Army in Luzon, with the North Luzon Force comprised of the 11th, 21st, and 31st Reserve Divisions, and the 1st Regular and Reserve 41st, 51st, and 71st Divisions, placed with the Luzon Force. The Visayan Mindanao Force was comprised of the 61st, 81st, and the 101st Division, and three other regiments. The 102nd Infantry formed from the 61st and 81st Field Artillery, with the 103rd Infantry together with C and E companies of the 43rd Philippine Scouts, fought the last defensive battles of the invasion campaign against the Japanese in Bukidnon on May 8, 1942. With the passing of the National Defense Act of 1935, the Philippine Constabulary became the premier unit of the nucleus of the new Philippine Army. The Constabulary was deactivated in 1936 and became the Constabulary Division of the Philippine Army. The short-lived, however, as the National Police Force that was formed to replace it was influential, and the Philippine Constabulary once again became the independent entity in 1938. With President Roosevelt's declaration of the state of emergency in 1941, the Constabulary was integrated along with the still forming Philippine Commonwealth Army into the USAF. 3PC infantry regiments were organized as a combat force were initially stationed in Balara, Quezon City. Among its first duties as a combat force was the safeguarding of essential facilities in the capital. Philippine constabulary units were also tasked to detain Japanese and hostile villains, civilian in the city. A fourth Philippine regiment was quickly formed in December and sent to Bataan. Now, if you're asking what is the 57th Regimental Scouts of the Philippines, they have a motto called Anywhere, Anytime. The 57th Infantry Scouts was organized on May 27, 1917 at Camp Wilson on Sam Houston, Texas, from the personnel of the 19th Infantry. It was reorganized on December 3, 1920 as the 57th Infantry Regiment, Philippine Scouts. From the personnel and equipment of the 2nd Philippine Infantry Regiment. It was reorganized again on March 1946, designated as the 78th Infantry Philippine Scouts. It was disbanded on October 10, 1951. Its regimental day is on June 9. Campaigns are on the Philippine Islands, 1941 and 1942. During World War II, the Philippine 57th Infantry Scouts repelled the Japanese all throughout Bataan Peninsula, the Abukay Line, the Battle of Mabatang, and the Battle of Points. The regiment earned 3 Distinguished Unit Citations and 1 Philippine Presidential Unit Citation. The Army awarded 95 decorations for valor to the officers and enlisted men of the regiment, including 1 Congressional Medal of Honor, 21 Distinguished Service Crosses, 68 silver medals, and 5 Bronze Star medals. The regiment surrendered on April 9, 1942 to the Japanese, but the regimental colors were hidden and saved. The Army reorganized the regiment on 1946, which was designated as the 78th Philippine Scouts. The regiment was disbanded completely in 1951. The 75th Infantry Regiment Philippine Scouts was an element of the Philippine Division U.S. Army based at McKinley, originally organized in the continental U.S. in 1917. This organization sailed to the Philippines with all its records and colors. It arrives on December 2, 1920, and designated as the Philippine Scouts Regiment the next day. Personnel from inactive 2nd Philippine Infantry Regiment Provisional were transferred to the 57th Infantry Philippine Scouts. The 2nd Philippine Infantry Provisional can trace its lineage back to 7 companies that were formed in 1901. In peacetime, a number of officers served in the 57th Infantry Philippine Scouts and would become famous generals, such as Colonel, later Lieutenant General Robert Saint, commanding officer of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division of Band of Brothers, fame. The regiment's accomplishments in marksmanship and field exercise ranks it high among the pre-war infantry regiments. Now, thank you for watching this video on learning the history of World War II in the Philippines and what is the most powerful Philippine Scout regiment of all time. Thank you for watching and goodbye. See you in the next video.